Hello everybody, I'm Bill Cope and this is Mary Kalantzis.
Hello everyone.
And we're here to present this plenary session at the E-Learning Innovative Pedagogies Conference in Rhodes. Now, of course, we're not in Rhodes, we're in Champaign, Illinois. We're only virtually in Rhodes. And we were planning this presentation to be about the nature of e-learning and innovative pedagogies, but since we originally put down a topic and decided what we were going to talk about, the world has, as everybody knows, quite radically changed. So this is the title for our presentation now. We're talking about the COVID crisis and the implications of this crisis for higher education, and particularly the role of e-learning in terms of this particular crisis. And our reference point, if you like, is the impact this is happening on universities like ours. We work in a traditional residential university, with fancy lawns and a big library and lecture theatres and classrooms and students milling around, all that kind of stuff. And the work that we do, Mary and I have we have only online students. We have actually one on-campus student, but we have 150 or 200 masters and doctoral students, all fully online. The work that we do is kind of out of sight, out of mind most of the time. But even more remarkably, our university is the biggest MOOC provider in the world. We have 2 million MOOC students. Mary and I have 20,000 MOOC students. We mirror all our regular courses in MOOCs as well. That's sort of not really in the field of consciousness of the people in our university. And honestly, even our university, as innovative as it is, has dragged its feet in making the move towards online teaching and learning. And look, suddenly everything's online. Everything we do in the university is online. But ours is a heavy duty residential university with we call it sort of the educational equivalent of an industrial plant. We have an educational plant, which are these buildings and physical infrastructure. And all of a sudden it's all empty. The residence halls have been emptied out. There's no food being served. And all of a sudden it's gone. It's changed, and we don't know how long for. Well, we know this much for sure. There's no way there'll be people back on campus before August, September. So, but if you take community colleges as well that don't have all this infrastructure, they still have lecture theatres and classrooms and textbooks as the core tools of their trade. And what we found in the case of our campus, where the biggest financial hit so far is simply around these ancillary place-bound services, the food and the accommodation. So here we are, everyone's online. Meanwhile, the conventional wisdom remains that online is second best. The gold standard for what we want to be doing in education is traditional face-to-face learning. And only reluctantly and in a piecemeal fashion have we tried to move the work that we do online. It's been marginal and it's been a side business, if you like, along the way. But here we go now, and this is what we see. We see here's a little kid doing their class with their teacher. And in fact, what we've got with something like Zoom, for example, is a traditional classroom where the teacher talks and somebody can put that little icon on to put up their hand and they can talk if they want to. And so on. What we've also had is people have tried to replicate traditional classrooms with video lectures and e-textbooks. We've got online tests, which are for all intents and purposes digital versions of the old stuff. We have learning management systems which just look like old-fashioned syllabi. Week by week, here's the readings, download the reading, have a look at it, upload your assignment, answer a quiz. So in a way, the infrastructures that we've got at this point replicate all that was wrong with old-fashioned didactic teaching by and large. And the experience of being in those may well be, for the new experience of being in those things may well be the kiss of death for online learning if it's a horrible experience for the teachers and learners that have been suddenly thrown in there. But one of the points we want to make is that regardless of this COVID-19 crisis, that we were on the edge of a structural crisis in higher education in which e-learning is possibly the main or the only solution to the structural crisis. So even before this, and I want to mention now just two aspects of that structural crisis. One aspect is ballooning student debt, which is simply the cost of what we do, right? So, you know, these fancy lecture theatres and manicured lawns, they're just ridiculously expensive. And what we've been doing is we've been asking students to pay more, and increasingly they can't. The second crisis is what we call an attentional crisis. This is a very different kind of crisis to the first, where you know, sitting in classes and listening to lectures is really an absurdly low, suboptimal cognitive load for today's students, and for us too, for that matter, where on our personal devices we've become habituated to designing our information feeds, skipping through our messages. You know, I know even when I'm sitting and watching a lecture or listening to a lecture, that I want to look a book up on Amazon, or I want to look up Wikipedia for an idea that I don't quite understand. And sitting in meetings even more so. I'm looking at my emails and doing 1,000 things. And by the way, sometimes sort of half successfully, to be quite frank. Certainly what you do in a lecture when you're looking stuff up supplements the lecture and doesn't, you know, your mind goes at a different kind of pace. And we've got used to that. So even if we didn't expect to have to move online so precipitously as we've had to since COVID-19, at the very least, these in-person learning environments that we've been in were ripe for a transformation. So at the University of Illinois, Mary and I have been researching this transformation and developing and testing online learning solutions for a number of years now. And as I mentioned before, as senior professors, unusually in a historically residential university, we only teach online. So I'm going to hand over to Mary now, who's going to sort of kick off our analysis of where we think we might be going.
All right, thanks, Bill. I'm going to provide you with, Bill and I are going to provide you with 5 reasons why we, as senior research professors, have chosen not to teach in person again. Our research and the tools that we've invented have convinced us that we could do something that is far superior. But more than that, and put very simply, online should be and can be completely different from in-person teaching. And we believe that with the right tools, and we've been involved in inventing some of those, but you do need appropriate tools, potentially the online environment can create ecosystems for teaching and learning which are far superior to in-person teaching. So we're going to argue some of the reasons why we might need to discard the back to the future learning management systems that we're all working with. I know all of you, you know, in our university and other universities, 100% have gone over to distance learning using the existing learning management systems that are there. But to reap the benefits of online learning, we need to abandon the current generation of educational technologies, which were invented a long time ago as marginal to the core business, and their systems and processes that, you know, have now become kind of embedded in most universities, which do little more than reverse engineer traditional classrooms. So our 5 points, Bill is going to start with the first one, and we will take turns introducing these points to you.
So the first point that we want to make is about this question of scale, scaling up higher education and scaling down its costs. So one of the issues about in-person education is that it just doesn't scale. So we're going to take on another 100 students. We've got to build another lecture theatre. We've got to have that many rooms with dormitories and whatever. So in other words, in terms of cost, the marginal cost doesn't go down as you scale up. as we mentioned just before, this is a crisis point. People can't afford it anymore. It's getting more expensive, and the market's not growing for people who can afford to do it or to take on the loans. But at the same time, what we want to do is, surely we want to increase the number of people going to college, going to university, perhaps towards universal college education, but if not, it certainly needs to go up a lot higher than what it is, because we're in this world which we call a knowledge society, and we've got artificial intelligence floating around us all the time, and we need to be on top of all these cognitive things that are happening for all the things we do in our lives. So surely we do, as a society, need more people in college education and higher education. But the only way to do that is to reduce the cost of this expensive physical plant, is what we're calling it. And online education is clearly a way to do this. But there's also an access issue as well, which is, the people, only a few could afford at a certain time of their life to come to a university. But a lot of the people who need university educations now are people who are workers, or people with domestic caring responsibilities who can't come to a college town like ours and take years out of their life to do a degree, or can't even go to a commuter college by day. So this is a huge demographic. And in fact, Mary and my students are all people who are teachers by day, or work in organisations where they do human resource training work, or they're people who work in publishers, or they're people who are app developers. So these are people who can't leave those jobs in order to do the degree which we offer, which is around learning design and the use of technologies in learning. But they're all people who desperately need those skills because the world's changing so rapidly. So this can only be achieved with online education. These are social goals which could only ever have been achieved that way. And look, unfortunately, what we do as a university is the online courses that we offer are only really offered at a small discount. They could be a lot cheaper though. They need, the sticker prices, to put it crudely, don't have to be as high as what they are. Now, of course, there are many countries in the world which have made a commitment to make higher education free. So, it's available freely in Germany and Italy and Greece, for example, in these European countries where the conference is. And Paolo Limoni, one of our speakers, is from Italy. But even if those countries are to scale up higher education, they really need to be thinking about the cost structures that they have, and online learning is a solution to those things. Now, of course, in the US, we've had some of the Democrat candidates talking about undergraduate education being free. Who knows whether that'll ever happen? At least it was part of the discussion. But nevertheless, even if it is made free, there's a question about what it will cost to scale it up in some important, in some significant ways. So I'm going to hand over to Mary now, who's going to introduce to us our second point.
Great. Okay, thanks, Bill. I have to say, because I know you're probably thinking this, us starting off with the issue of the financing of education is very political and very contentious. Sometimes it's dismissed as neoliberal ways of reducing what's happening in education, but we don't believe that. We believe we have to be engaged in thinking about what the appropriate model would be that would allow for universal access to education and superior ways of engaging. So I'm going to move to the point that really matters to us, the most important point, and that is that in the digital space, if it's going to be effective, if it's going to be different, we need to develop pedagogies of social knowledge and collaborative intelligence. The world we're moving in requires that. The old didactic pedagogy required you to be a competitive individual and learn particular things for particular outcomes. But today's world requires ongoing, lifelong and life-wide knowledge, and it requires that we solve problems collectively. Now, of course, those who support in-person learning don't believe that you can engage people or learn effectively without the human interaction in the in-person learning environment. Because I want you to think about this. In a lecture theatre, where you might have 100 students or even more, all the students have to sit silently while the one instructor speaks. And in the regular classroom, when there's a discussion, typically only one person gets to speak at a time. The others have to sit and wait or approve or silently disagree with whoever gave the answer that the teacher required. In these respects, the lecture theatre and the classroom are hardly social, except when it comes to communicating pathogens, and that's why we're all online now, quite frankly. But we have to admit that not only are these suboptimal forms of communication in the era of social media, paradoxically, the communication architecture are systems of social isolation. Even though we imagine we are together, the space for genuine interaction is very limited in these architectures. The difference online could be as follows. The educator might create a video, not like the lectures of old, but in short, digestible chunks. These would not simply be about telling any particular thing, but ways of prompting discussion and eliciting contribution from students, all of them, in the feed below the video. The lecture of the truly flipped classroom certainly should not be a recording of old-style in-person lectures, shoveling out content. The students can stop and start the video, they can review it or skip it, they can slow down or double the speed. And of course, in these digital environments, you can add learning analytics, which will assess the learner as they progress through whatever they're engaging in, and will credit the students for their engagement. If you take the classroom discussion, you have environments in the digital space where instead of one person speaking at a time, everyone can comment in a social media-like feed at the same time or at their convenience. These discussions, as I think many of you have learned now, can be synchronous or asynchronous. And engagement does not have to be locked into four walls of the classroom or the cells of the timetable or the ringing of the bell to move from one subject to the other. In these environments, in these digital ecosystems, students don't earn the conventional rewards for arrogance, hogging the space or, being too dominant, and nor are they penalized for social inhibitions or reticence. We know that these dynamics that are in our classrooms, our face-to-face classrooms, do create imbalances of participation in our traditional classrooms. Indeed, in the e-learning environment, everyone can be required to respond and to measurably equivalent degrees. And of course, as I've already mentioned, learning analytics can track every learner's engagement. This is simply a far superior communication and pedagogical architecture.
Okay, so I'm going to go on now and talk about our third point. And the third point here is about we can create pedagogies of intense engagement, far more engaging than the traditional model ever was. So frankly, in the traditional model, learners are positioned as knowledge consumers. They listen to the lecture or they're reading the textbook content. And eventually what they do is they demonstrate the absorption of acquired knowledge at in the end of course summative assessment. Now, I'm not going to criticize this kind of legacy architecture in the sense that this may have been a matter of logistical necessity in heritage educational architectures. But rather than just put these online in recorded lectures and e-textbooks, learning ecology, E-learning ecologies open up really genuinely new possibilities. That's what we want to be arguing here. So in online architectures, it's possible to position learners as knowledge producers and co-contributors in knowledge communities. So one way to do this is to have students research and make posts into the class activity stream that exemplify the themes prompted by instructors. So, you know, you can't do that in a lecture theatre, and you can't do that in a textbook, and it's not that easy to do it in a learning management system. Another way is to create peer-reviewed projects where interim feedback in the knowledge production process comes from multiple perspectives. Peer feedback, the instructor can chip in with feedback, and also machine feedback along the way. So in other words, what we've got is we've got, you know, an incremental social collaborative process around a piece of project work. Then the projects can be published and shared by the instructor to the community, into the community as collective knowledge we've created together. Now, of course, project-based learning is an old idea, and doing stuff together collectively is an old idea. But the problem was it was always logistically fiddly, complex, more trouble than it's worth, much harder than doing a lecture. But to build these environments and to set the prompts in place and to build the rubrics that go with them is actually now relatively easy, and the social complexity can be managed around peer review allocation and the like. So in other words, we can build these environments of intense engagement in these, which were just logistically challenging before. And what the phrase that Mary and I use to describe these things is e-learning ecologies. So where we're leveraging the social collaborative complexity, which is enabled by things that we call social knowledge technologies. Now, let me explain that term. We're not using the word social media because social media, you know, as interesting as they kind of are as a phenomenon and as influential as they are in terms of what we might do, they're completely inappropriate for learning because A, the size of their community chunks is so small. I mean, you can't learn by doing tweets. And even in a medium like Facebook, where the chunk is a bit bigger, it's a kind of it's not designed for serious thought work. So in the work that Mary and I have been doing, we've been trying to build something which is kind of a compromise between social media and a blog. But also even the algorithms that run these feeds and prioritize posts are completely antithetical to what we want to achieve in education. Popularity, that's a bad idea, you know, in education. You know, and of course the prioritization of algorithms around advertising priorities, the underlying agenda of the social media businesses is not right. So what we're advocating here is building a new type of technology that we call a social knowledge technology. And that's the work that Mary and I have been working on, our research and development work. But one of the interesting things about these environments is that what we can do is that we can have embedded on-the-fly formative assessments that track community engagement and personal progress. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We've had an NSF grant just now where we've built these kinds of tracking of this deep intellectual engagement and collaborative work, if you like. And if you like, it gives students and instructors a far richer and more reliable picture of learning, these learning analytics do, than was ever possible in a traditional test. So Mary and I have this slogan, which is the test is dead, long live assessment. But it's a different kind of assessment. It's formative assessment, it's incremental assessment. So everything is assessment now. There isn't a distinction anymore between assessment and instruction. And also assessment kind of disappears in terms of the old-fashioned artifacts of the test. So I'm going to go on now to the fourth point before Mary takes us on to the final point, which is in this particular talk. And the fourth point is this one here, which is a focus on higher order thinking, right? So these are ambitious possibilities that we believe are real possibilities in this environment. Now, to take as our counterpoint traditional instruction and assessment, what traditional instruction and assessment does, it measures essentially long-term memory. So the exams at the end of the semester or the quiz at the end of the week or whatever that is, it's measuring long-term memory. And what it's measuring in long-term memory is a fact that you can remember or a procedure that you can correctly apply. You can apply the formula and get the right answer, right? And you want a definition of long-term learning? Well, long-term learning is, the definition of long-term is until the day of the test, right? Because that's the measure. It doesn't matter if you forget it the day after, particularly because the test is what measures your learning. But in effect, even focusing on long-term memory as the fundamental objective, the underlying objective. The underlying objective is long-term memory of whatever you're learning. Even to focus on that is becoming increasingly anachronistic. Here we are close to our bodies, in our pockets. We have these phones where we can look up anything and everything in the world. They remember things for us. We can write notes, things that we need to remember. We can look up Wikipedia. We can, use an app to apply a procedure. And there's far more knowledge in our pockets and on our laptops, on our phones and in our laptops than we could ever remember. And we've got apps that can execute procedures for us. So why would we bother with long-term memory as a fundamental goal in education, implicitly the fundamental goal in education? So we call these things, these objects that we have, cognitive prostheses. These, if you like, are extensions of our minds, which become an integral part of our thinking, and in a way are far superior, practically, to what long-term memory ever was. Now, what this means is that the foundational objectives of education change, and the role of e-learning then becomes incredibly important as a kind of intermediary in the use of these devices as cognitive prostheses. So what learning is now, it's not about long-term memory, but it's about the careful navigation of at-hand knowledge resources. And by the way, because they're at hand, we can track what every learner is doing in navigating these resources. It's about the appropriate application of machine-supported procedures. So what becomes much more important than long-term memory is what we call higher-order thinking. So what we can have students doing in this space is critical thinking, creative thinking, design thinking. So in their projects, they're thinking of a design solution which they're documenting. What are the objectives? How am I going to realize it? How did I then build it? What were the outcomes? So I might be building something entirely new. I might be doing creative thinking where I've recombined from these resources in the world a set of ideas which are uniquely voicing my own creative understanding of these things. I might have critical perspectives on things where I've seen one angle and I've seen another. So these are all examples of higher order thinking. Now, in fact, what we've been doing in our research, which is the most interesting and exciting part, is to see whether we can have learners train the machines using developing machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence to actually support these critical, creative and design thinking processes. Impossible except if the learners are doing that work, their learning work in these kinds of spaces. So our conclusion to this point really is that the core capacities required by graduates today are changing rapidly, and we need to change our objectives. And today's graduate capabilities include things like evidence-based reasoning, argumentation in support of verifiable claims, and testable judgment calls. These are these higher order thinking goals that we're looking at. And online environments can uniquely achieve this by leveraging collaborative intelligence processes and using artificial intelligence to track what learners are doing. And the term we use to describe these kinds of things is complex epistemic performance. Remembering something and applying a procedure correctly is not complex epistemic performance. It's pretty low level. So they're some of the objectives that we've been looking at, and I'm going to hand over to Mary now, who's going to now address our fifth point in our argument.
Great. Now you can see from this slide that Bill's just putting up now that although we started with scaling and costs, our real emphasis in this presentation today is to inspire you to think about what could be pedagogically different, because as you've all discovered, all of us collectively, what we've had to do now in such a hurried way has been both painful and perhaps exciting, but it won't make a difference in the lives of learners or even in our lives as academics and teachers unless we address pedagogy, social knowledge, engagement, and higher order thinking. You know, who are we? What do we do? Do we just deliver content that students consume, or do we engage them in real life issues and prepare them to be citizens and learners and workers in the complex world that they're engaged with? And we have been arguing that there are affordances in the digital that allow us to do things that we couldn't do before. And I'm going to address the fifth issue that we're putting up here, which we've called lifelong and life-wide learning. Right, so education, whether it's in school or universities, has always been chunks for us. It's periods of our life. Universities and colleges in particular, since that's the focus today, have been for several centuries a time of our life. We talk about them as a specific period, a formative period, a time when we made friends, a time when we were away from our families perhaps. They leave a mark as a distinct lifetime experience. But it has also required that students are, for a time, taken out of life. They're removed from their families, from their communities, their work, to spend time in the buildings and spaces controlled by, the architecture of didactic pedagogy. And we know that this institutional form can be tracked back, all the way back to its monastic origins and the monastic origins of the universities in the early modern West and in the East. So online learning, by contrast, can be, and we argue should be, embedded in the real world. It can be continuous. It doesn't have to be bound by walls or bells or timetables. It can last for as long as life and stretch as wide as any social and personal need. And what Bill and I in particular admire about the students in our online courses is that day by day, they're in the world. You know, there are masters and doctoral students who come into our courses and bring the knowledge and experience that we instructors could never have imagined. Although they have to follow the kinds of themes and topics and concepts that we introduce to them, they contribute to those themes and to that content as partners with us and become part of a knowledge community. Moreover, they can also test live in the real world context that they come from the new things that they've been learning in our class. This is a very different way of engaging with learners and it contributes to blurring the boundary between traditional schooling, traditional education, and life and the issues that we need to address in life.
So now I'm going to conclude, and here's this image of a doctoral student defending their dissertation online. Something would have been unthinkable a little while ago, and there we have a young girl doing her violin lesson online, something that would also have been unthinkable until this crisis came about. So what I want to do is I just want to conclude this presentation now with a problem. And the problem is that none of the main commercial or open source learning management systems can do what we've just promised or what we've just argued should happen. The potential's there, of course, but all of them rely on a 1990s teacher-centered pedagogy, or no, a 1990s hub and spoke file upload, download architecture, and a much older, in fact, teacher-centered set of pedagogies, centuries old. And none of them are adequately instrumented for what we call social knowledge. They're not social knowledge technologies. They're file shuffling technologies. They're not instrumented for collaborative learning, and they're absolutely not instrumented for artificial intelligence. What I mean by that is, to the extent that social media is highly responsive, there are no files or documents in Twitter or Facebook. What we have is pages being constantly recomposed on the fly based on interaction that's happening on the fly. There's a big database down the back, and that's how it happens. The learning management system we have are architected around file sharing. It is impossible to do the things we say in there. And Marianne and I have been working on alternative models, alternative systems. We've been working with computer scientists at the University of Illinois. We've built a platform called CG Scholar, and we're constantly frustrated to see these really suboptimal, awful systems out there and being used, and the intrinsic constraints they will never allow to happen, some of the things we desperately believe should happen and want to happen. So, you know, so this, in this time of crisis, we're going to say this: look, how can we seize the day? How can we imagine a different future for higher education? So if we're to develop a stance that we call strategic optimism, we might be on the cusp of the biggest change in education since the social processes and artifacts of higher education were invented in their current form in early modern times. The learning management systems, which are essentially 1990s technologies and products, don't do it, but we may be on the cusp of a big change yet. And it may well be that, in fact, even using these horrible systems have nudged us a little bit in this direction as well. But the great danger is that as people are thrown abruptly into online learning now, and they use these flawed systems with limited training, that what will happen, it'll just confirm their worst fears about the quality and the nature of the online teaching and learning experience. So focus investment really needs to be made in people and technology to renew and revitalise our pedagogical, social and educational values.
And can I say that we need to acknowledge that all of you, educators and administrators, have shown heroic effort during this crisis in making the enormous transitions you have made. But it's a time to document what we're doing, to reflect upon it, to see what works and what doesn't work, and to participate in reshaping the future. And that involves rethinking our identities as educators, as professors and as scholars, because it's now become incumbent upon us to be part of the design of the very system in which we participate in. So we hope we've inspired you to think positively about learning from this moment where 100% of all university teaching and learning has been thrust into the digital space. So good luck to all of you.
Thank you very much, folks. Bye then.